So, for our third lecture on biology and cells, we're going to talk about the cell and the structure of the cell. And one of my favorite quotes from my lecturers on the topic of the cell is that it is essentially a water-filled fat sack, which I think is wonderful because it goes a long way to demystify the entire kind of concept of a cell. It's not this magically held together little polyp of proteins and wizardry. It is in fact a little membrane of fat molecules filled with water, and it's like a water balloon, which, given the scale of it, doesn't burst, but it can be burst. Now, we can think of cells as kind of a building or as a city, but the point of it is that depending on the species you have, so if we're talking about eukaryotes, we have different areas that do different things. And if we're talking about prokaryotes, it's a little bit more simplified, but indeed there are different kind of, there's the cell wall, which is the cell wall in prokaryotes, and then the rest of the stuff is just kind of in there. But in eukaryotes, we have different apparatus. We have Golgi, we have nucleus, we have mitochondria. There's more than that. And each of them does a different thing. And so we have specialization within the cell, and all these different tissues do special things. Not tissues, organelles. Organelles. Right. So, first thing to note, all cells have cell membranes. All cells have cell membranes. That's just a thing. They all do. Take it down. Know it. Because I was kind of doubtful. Like, can you have a cell without a cell? No, you can't. You need to have a cell membrane. Interestingly, bacteria have at least 2 lipid bilayers, which we'll talk about what a lipid bilayer is in a moment. And eukaryotes only have 1, which I think is fun. Cell membranes, semi-permeable. So what does semi-permeable mean? Well, let's talk about the lipid bilayer so we can get an idea of what's going on. And in a later lecture in this exact module, we'll talk about what lipids are and this whole thing. But for the moment, there's this little section. So this is actually 2 little lipid bilayer sections. So this is the outside of the cell, and this is the inside of the cell, and this repeats the whole way through. Now, what you find is that these little phosphoheads, they're hydrophilic. They really enjoy water. And these little lipid tails, they don't enjoy water. They are non-charged, they're hydrophobic. And so this is one of my favorite things about biology just to start with, is that cell walls spontaneously assemble. They come together all on their own. Right, so these hydrophobic little tails get attracted to each other. The hydrophilic little heads at the end, they get attracted to the water, and then they spontaneously form the cell wall. And there are different kind of structures of these, but we'll get to that later. And so, how can this structure be semi-permeable? Remember, this structure goes all the way around a cell, and it gives us the cell membrane. Now, in plants it's a little different, but for bacteria and eukaryotes, they're pretty good. And so what this means is that small uncharged particles don't interact with this area, and they can just go straight through. And that's how it can be semi-permeable. Now, there's a whole lot more detail on that. That's a really, really basic introduction. We'll do a proper introduction to the structure of the cell wall later. But, semi-permeable. In addition, what needs to go in and what needs to go out? Well, nutrients come in, waste goes out. That's the basics of that. Nutrients come in and waste comes out. Right, prokarya and eukarya. Hope I've spelled that right, maybe I haven't. But prokarya, like I drew that timeline in the previous couple of lectures, prokarya are bacteria, and they were around for ages. Literal ages. Not even figurative or exaggeratory ages. They were around for a really, really long time. And the way I remember it is prokaryotes are the pros of life. And eukarya is the other one. Now, we are eukarya, plants are eukarya, pretty much everything that you think of on a daily basis is eukarya except bacteria. And the thing that differentiates that is that prokarya do not have a nucleus bound. They do not have a nucleus. So what the prokarya actually means is pre-seed or pre-kernel, so before the nucleus was invented or evolved. And so eukarya have a nucleus, which they keep the DNA in very kindly, and they have that, and prokarya just have their DNA hanging out, doing the thing. Woo! And that's the main difference between prokarya and eukarya. So remember, the prokarya are the pros, the professionals of life, because they've been around for such a darn long time, and eukarya are the other one. Now, size of cells. And I find this fascinating, actually, the size of bacteria as compared to eukaryotic cells, because it's just very interesting, I think. So, use my trusty sock. So bacteria are 1 to 10 micrometers. 1 to 10 micrometers. And eukaryotic cells are 10 to 100. Yeah, that should be like that. 1 to 10 to 100. So, you know, between a factor of 10 and 100 size difference, which, you know, is quite substantial, and it's quite interesting that we kind of think of all cells as just really tiny things, but really a bacterium is to a human cell as a mouse is to a human, right? Like, it's 100 times bigger. And so I think that's really cool. And it can that bacterium, if it gets infected, kind of wreaks a whole lot of havoc, which wouldn't be the greatest. And then the last thing is there's this thing called the phylogenetic tree, which I'll draw very roughly. And the phylogenetic tree we need to just note right now. So remember our theory of evolution before, in that everything has a common ancestor. And so that goes all the way back here. And then we have our prokarya and we have our eukarya. And the important thing that I just say here is that the length of the branches corresponds to a genetic difference, which we can determine based on sequencing the genome, etc. And so we just remember there's a thing called a phylogenetic tree, and it shows us how similar various organisms are based on their descendants from the common ancestor. And that is our lovely little lecture on the cell structure.